Hey guys! Tonight we're diving into something particularly grisly. A world where workplace safety consisted of try not to die, and OSHA would have had an absolute meltdown. Look, I know you think your job is rough. Your boss emails you at 9 PM the office coffee tastes like it was filtered through a sweaty sock, and Karen from accounting keeps stealing your lunch from the break room fridge. But trust me, after hearing about these medieval career paths, you'll be kissing your ergonomic chair tomorrow morning. If you're enjoying this little journey into history's workplace nightmares, go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are joining us from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see who is tuning in from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that perfect background white noise, and get comfortable. So, take a deep breath of that clean modern air. You'll appreciate it more after this, as we journey back to a time when workplace hazard meant something entirely different. Let's begin. Let's dive right into our first medieval career nightmare, the gong farmers, also delightfully known as night soil men. If you're eating dinner right now, you might want to pause the video. Consider yourself warned. Imagine your job is literally swimming in other people's excrement. Not metaphorically, like when your boss dumps their work on you before a long weekend. I mean, actually, physically immersing yourself in human waste. Welcome to the glamorous life of a medieval gong farmer. In an age before indoor plumbing, medieval towns had a serious waste management problem. Most households used cesspits, basically holes in the ground where everything went. And by everything, I mean everything. Human waste, kitchen scraps, whatever mysterious liquid that was, all dumped into a hole that would eventually fill up. And when it did, someone had to empty it. Enter our heroes, the gong farmers. These poor souls would descend into these pits, often 16 feet deep or more, armed with nothing but shovels, buckets, and presumably a complete inability to smell anything anymore. They'd scoop out the contents, load them into barrels and cart them outside the city walls, all under cover of darkness, because even medieval people knew nobody wanted to see this happening in broad daylight. Why? At night? Well, partly to spare the delicate sensibilities of the townsfolk, but mostly because the smell was so catastrophically bad that doing this work during business hours would have essentially shut down the entire town. Imagine the worst smell you've ever experienced. Multiply it by 1,000. Add some medieval rotting food waste, and you're getting close. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. These cesspits weren't just disgusting, they were deadly. The waste produced methane gas as it decomposed, which could build up in these enclosed spaces. One spark, one lamp flame too close, and boom, a literal explosion of sewage that could kill the gong farmer instantly. Others would pass out from the fumes and drown in the very waste they were trying to remove. A medieval workplace fatality that's particularly undignified, even by the standards of the time. And if the immediate dangers weren't enough, there were the long-term health effects. Constant exposure to human waste meant parasitic infections, skin diseases, respiratory problems, all in an era where healthcare meant someone might drill a hole in your head if you complained of a headache. There was no hazard pay, no sick leave, certainly no company-provided hand sanitizer. But here's the twist. Despite being literally the bottom of the social ladder, gong farmers were actually paid surprisingly well. Like, really well. Some made more than skilled artisans. Supply and demand at its finest. When nobody wants a job, the pay goes up. Way up. Some records show London gong farmers in the late medieval period earning more than 3 times what a skilled craftsman might make. The original dirty jobs, clean money scenario. They even developed their own tools and techniques, special shovels called gongs, hence the name, long-handled ladles, and early versions of protective clothing made from leather. They had their own guild in some cities. Imagine those guild meetings and social events. The waste itself, believe it or not, had value. It was transported outside city walls and sold to farmers as fertilizer. Medieval recycling at its finest. But this created another problem, the transport. Picture wooden carts filled to the brim with human waste, trundling through narrow streets, sloshing with every cobblestone and pothole. Spillage wasn't just common, it was inevitable. And if you were unfortunate enough to be out late when the night soil carts came through, well, Watch Your Step doesn't quite cover it. In London, these workers had their own dock on the Thames, literally called Dung Wharf, where they'd load their noxious cargo onto boats, because obviously, what every river needs is a dedicated poop dock. The profession was typically hereditary, passed from father to son, a legacy of filth and disease that families couldn't escape. When your dad brings you to work for Take Your Child to Work Day, and it's a cesspit, you know your career path is pretty much set. So the next time you flush a toilet, spare a thought for the medieval gong farmer, perhaps history's smelliest profession and certainly one of its most dangerous. The job stank, literally, but someone had to do it, or medieval towns would have quickly become uninhabitable mountains of waste. And trust me, we're just getting started with these medieval occupational nightmares. The gong farmers had it bad, but wait until you hear about our next profession, where toxic chemicals and rotting flesh were just another day at the office. Now that we've thoroughly ruined your appetite with tales of medieval sewage management, let's move on to something completely different, but equally revolting. Welcome to the world of medieval tanners, where your workspace smelled so bad that you were legally required to live and work outside city walls. When your profession gets its own zoning laws, you know you've reached a special level of repulsiveness. Tanners turned animal hides into leather, a crucial material in the medieval world. Leather was everywhere: your shoes, belts, saddles, armor, book bindings, drinking vessels. No plastic limited textiles. Leather was the medieval equivalent of, well, practically everything, and someone had to make it. Let's break down what a day in the life of a tanner actually involved. First, you'd receive fresh animal skins, and by fresh, I mean still dripping with blood, and often with bits of flesh still attached. Your first job? Soak these delightful specimens in urine. Yes, urine. Human urine. Tanners would actually place collection vessels around town for people to contribute their liquid waste. Think of it as a medieval recycling program, except disgusting. Why urine, you ask? The ammonia in urine helped break down the hide's proteins and prepare it for tanning. And if you think collecting public urine was bad, just wait. It gets better. After the urine bath, the hides needed their fur removed. This was done by smearing them with a paste made from lime, water and, wait for it, dog feces. The workers would then scrape the loosened hair off with special curved knives. Imagine spending your day elbow deep in this concoction. No wonder they weren't invited to many dinner parties. But we're still not at the actual tanning part yet. Once the hides were clean of hair and flesh, they were soaked in a solution made from the bark of oak or other trees rich in tannic acid, hence the term tanning. This process could take months, with workers constantly moving the skins from one solution to another, agitating them and checking their progress. Now for the occupational hazards, and they were substantial. First, there was the immediate physical danger. The tools of the trade included sharp knives, stretching frames, and heavy wooden drums. Sliced fingers, crushed limbs, and other injuries were commonplace. But that was just the beginning. The real killers were the chemicals. Tanners routinely worked with caustic lime, which could cause severe chemical burns. The acidic tanning solutions damaged skin and lungs. Constant exposure to rotting organic matter meant bacterial infections were just part of the job. And then there were the fumes, a toxic cocktail of ammonia, methane, hydrogen sulfide, and other delightful gases that caused everything from headaches and respiratory problems to neurological damage. Oh, and did I mention anthrax? That's right. The deadly disease could be transmitted through animal hides. A tiny cut on a tanner's hand could be a death sentence if the wrong bacteria entered the wound. Medieval tanners had no understanding of germ theory, no antibiotics, and certainly no OSHA regulations about handling potentially contaminated materials. The smell was so monumentally awful that tanners were usually required by law to live and work outside city walls, often downstream so their waste wouldn't contaminate the town's water supply. They formed their own little communities of stench, where presumably no one could smell anyone else because their own odour was equally potent. When your entire profession needs to be quarantined, that's a pretty strong hint about your workplace environment. Tanners were easily identifiable by their stained hands, permanently discoloured brown from the tannins, and by the smell that no amount of medieval soap could remove. They were social outcasts despite producing an essential material. People wanted leather, they just didn't want to acknowledge where it came from or who made it. The tanning industry was so toxic that many towns had regulations about where tanneries could dump their waste, making them early targets of medieval environmental laws. Their wastewater was a poisonous soup of chemicals, decomposing organic matter, and various bodily fluids that could kill fish and contaminate drinking water. Basically, they were one-man environmental disasters. Yet despite all this, the danger, the disgust, the social isolation, tanning was often a family business passed down through generations. Children would start learning the trade as young as 7 years old, their small hands useful for certain tasks. Imagine bringing your child to work and saying, "One day, all this urine and dog feces will be yours, son. So the next time you admire a beautiful leather jacket or bag, spare a thought for the medieval tanner, whose life expectancy was notably shorter than average, whose hands would never be truly clean again, and who probably couldn't smell flowers or food or anything pleasant after years in the profession. They gave their health, social standing, and often their lives to make the material that clothed and equipped medieval Europe. And if you thought tanners had it bad, wait until you hear about our next profession, where the phrase "going to work" could very literally mean descending into the underworld, never to return. We've covered swimming in human waste and bathing animal skins in urine, but now let's literally descend into the underworld with medieval miners and quarrymen, the people who dug holes in the earth until those holes sometimes became their graves. Mining in the Middle Ages wasn't just dangerous, it was practically a suicide mission with a paycheck. Imagine voluntarily entering a poorly ventilated hole in the ground, lit only by the flickering flame of an oil lamp, knowing there's a decent chance you might never come back up. And yet, thousands did this daily, because medieval society needed metals and stone just as desperately as we do today. Let's start with the mines themselves. Unlike modern mines with their reinforced tunnels and safety protocols, medieval mines were essentially just holes. Narrow, twisting passages carved by hand, with the most basic tools, picks, hammers and wedges. Support structures. Sometimes a few wooden beams if you were lucky. Ventilation, maybe a shaft or two that allowed a whisper of fresh air to reach the depths. Safety inspections, please. The concept of workplace safety was about 6 centuries away from being invented. Your typical day as a medieval miner would begin with a descent into darkness. In some mines, this meant climbing down crude ladders. In others, you'd be lowered in a basket or bucket that was one frayed rope away from disaster. Some miners simply climbed down notches cut into the rock face, essentially scaling a cliff in reverse in the dark, while carrying tools. Once at the bottom, the real fun began. Most mining involved literally hammering at rock faces with iron tools, breaking off small chunks at a time. For harder rock, a technique called fire setting was used, building a fire against the rock face to heat it, then dousing it with cold water to crack the stone. Imagine working in a space filled with smoke from these fires, with no ventilation except those distant air shafts. The immediate dangers were obvious and numerous. Cave-ins weren't just an occupational hazard, they were an expectation. Without proper engineering or understanding of geology, tunnels collapsed regularly. A misplaced hammer strike, a poorly positioned support beam, or just bad luck, and suddenly, tons of rock were burying workers alive. Then there were the gases. Miners called it damp, but these weren't just unpleasant smells. Fire damp, methane, could explode with any spark or flame. Black damp, carbon dioxide, would silently suffocate. White damp, carbon monoxide, would make you dizzy, confused, then dead. The miner's only detection system? Bring a caged canary with you. If the bird died, you had minutes to escape. Some miners didn't even get that luxury. They'd just suddenly collapse as the invisible killers filled their lungs. Water was another constant threat. Many mines extended below the water table, meaning they were in constant danger of flooding. Primitive pumps sometimes helped, but they were no match for a sudden breach into an underground water source. Miners could drown in minutes if they were in the wrong place when water rushed in. The physical toll was immense. Miners worked in cramped positions for hours, often unable to fully stand in the low tunnels. They breathed in rock dust that gradually transformed their lungs into something resembling stone themselves. Silicosis, the slow killer that ensured, even if you survived the immediate dangers, your career would likely end in a painful, gasping death. Children were frequently employed in mines, their small bodies perfect for squeezing through narrow shafts adults couldn't navigate. Some began mining as young as 6 or 7 years old, their growth often stunted by malnutrition and the crushing physical demands. Many never saw adulthood. Quarrying, the extraction of stone from surface pits rather than underground mines, wasn't much safer. Workers dangled on scaffolds or ropes as they cut huge blocks of stone from cliff faces. The blocks themselves weighed tons and could crush workers during extraction or transport. One slip, one rope failure, one misjudged cut, and you'd be a red smear on a very expensive piece of building material. The pay was meagre compared to the risks. While miners of precious metals might occasionally strike it rich, most barely earned enough to feed their families. They were essentially trading their health and lives for bare survival. Companies, or more often local lords who controlled the mines, provided virtually nothing in terms of support. If you were injured, you were on your own. If you died, your family might receive a pittance in compensation, but more likely, nothing at all. The medieval attitude toward industrial accidents was essentially, well, that's unfortunate, followed by immediately replacing you with another desperate worker. The lifespan of a career miner was shockingly short. Many didn't make it past their 30s, their bodies broken by the physical demands, their lungs destroyed by dust and gases, or their lives abruptly ended in one of the countless ways the earth could claim them. And yet, without these miners and quarrymen, medieval society couldn't have functioned. No silver for coins, no iron for tools and weapons, no stone for castles and cathedrals. The great achievements of medieval architecture, those soaring Gothic cathedrals and impenetrable stone fortresses, were built quite literally on the broken bodies of quarry workers. So next time you visit a medieval castle or cathedral, look beyond the impressive stonework and imagine the human cost, the countless unnamed miners and quarrymen who never lived to see the completed structures their labour made possible. But if you think mining was bad, wait until you hear about our next profession, where workers literally played with fire and molten metal on a daily basis, and where success was measured by whether you still had all your fingers and eyesight at the end of the day. We've journeyed through filth, chemicals, and the depths of the earth. Now let's turn up the heat, literally, as we explore the world of medieval metal workers and bell founders, where hot working conditions took on a whole new meaning. Imagine your workplace is essentially a controlled inferno. You're surrounded by temperatures reaching over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, with molten metal that can melt flesh on contact, and you're managing it all with leather gloves and intuition. Welcome to the medieval foundry, where metal was transformed from ore to object through a process that claimed lives, limbs, and lungs with alarming regularity. Let's start with the bells, those massive bronze monsters that hung in church towers across Europe. A single large church bell could weigh several tons. Making one wasn't just difficult, it was a dangerous spectacle that entire towns would come to witness, partly because of the impressive technical feat, and partly because, well, someone might die in dramatic fashion. Bell founding began with the creation of a mould, a complex process involving clay, horse manure, and precise measurements. The inner core and outer casing had to be perfectly shaped, with the space between them forming the bell. One mistake in the mould and days of work would be wasted. Worse, a flawed mould could crack during casting, releasing a tsunami of molten bronze onto workers. Once the mould was ready, the truly dangerous part began, the melt. Workers would feed a furnace with charcoal, pumping bellows constantly to reach the extreme temperatures needed to liquefy bronze, a mixture of copper and tin. The heat was so intense that workers would often suffer heat stroke, dehydration, and burns just from standing near the furnace. Many foundry workers were permanently disfigured by burns received during their career. When the bronze was finally melted, it had to be transported from the furnace to the mould. This was done using large crucibles or ladles, essentially carrying buckets of liquid metal that could instantly kill anyone it splashed on. One stumble, one weakened handle, One moment of dizziness from the heat, and you'd be wearing molten metal. There was no treatment for these burns. If you were lucky enough to survive, you'd be scarred for life, often unable to continue working. The actual pour was the most dangerous moment. Several workers would coordinate to tip the crucibles, directing a stream of glowing metal into the mould. If the mould was even slightly damp, the moisture would instantly become steam, potentially causing an explosion of molten metal. These metal bombs could shower everyone nearby with burning droplets. The lucky ones just got small scars. The unlucky ones didn't survive to tell the tale. After cooling, which could take days for a large bell, came the finishing work. Files, chisels and abrasives were used to tune the bell to the right pitch. This produced fine metal dust that workers inhaled constantly. Over time, this led to a condition called metal fume fever, or more permanently, serious lung damage. Many older metalworkers were recognizable by their chronic cough and weakened state. And bells were just one aspect of metalworking. Let's talk about blacksmiths, the backbone of medieval technology. Everything from nails to ploughs to weapons required their expertise. Their forges were smaller than bell foundries, but no less dangerous. Burns were so common that they were considered just part of the job, not even worth mentioning unless they prevented work. Many smiths had arms covered in small circular scars from flying sparks and scale, the flakes of oxidized metal that fly off when hammering hot iron. Eye injuries were extremely common. With no safety glasses, metalworkers were constantly at risk from flying metal fragments. A tiny shard of hot metal in the eye could cause blindness, and medieval medicine had nothing to offer except perhaps a poultice of herbs that did absolutely nothing. Then there were the exotic metals, and by exotic, I mean will definitely kill you slowly. Lead workers made pipes, roofing and stained glass frames, absorbing lead through their skin and lungs daily. The symptoms of lead poisoning, weakness, confusion, irritability, were so common among these workers that they were considered personality traits, rather than symptoms of poisoning. Many went mad before they died, victims of neurological damage they couldn't understand. Mercury was used in gilding, creating a thin layer of gold on objects by forming an amalgam with mercury, then heating it to drive the mercury off as vapour. This process, called fire gilding, exposed workers to mercury vapour that caused tremors, personality changes, and death. The Mad Hatter of Alice in Wonderland fame comes from this era. Hat makers used mercury compounds and frequently suffered mental deterioration. Safety equipment barely existed. Some workers wore leather aprons and gloves, but these offered minimal protection against extreme heat or toxic metals. Ventilation was limited to windows and doors, which were often kept closed in winter, allowing toxic fumes to concentrate. Protective eyewear wasn't invented yet. Your safety protocol was essentially, try not to die today. Despite the dangers, metalworkers held relatively high status in medieval society. Their skills were essential and required years of training. Blacksmiths, whitesmiths, who worked with white metals like tin and pewter, and goldsmiths could earn good livings and even achieve considerable wealth and influence. Bell founders were particularly respected. Their work was seen as partly artistic and partly miraculous, creating objects that would call communities to prayer for centuries. But that respect came at a terrible price. Few metalworkers enjoyed old age. Their bodies broke down from the physical demands, their lungs failed from years of smoke and metal dust, and many suffered from chronic metal poisoning. The beautiful objects they created, from delicate jewellery to mighty bells, were often monuments to their own shortened lives. So the next time you hear church bells ringing, remember the medieval workers who risked and often lost their lives, creating those massive bronze voices, standing in pools of their own sweat, breathing toxic fumes and gambling with molten metal, all to create something that would outlive them by centuries. But as dangerous as metalworking was, at least you could see the threats coming. Our next profession involves invisible killers, the kind that crept into your body and destroyed you from within, all while you thought you were providing an essential service to a terrified population. We've explored professions where danger came in obvious forms: sewage, chemicals, cave-ins, molten metal. But now, Let's turn to perhaps the most terrifying medieval occupations of all, those who battled invisible killers during times of epidemic. When the Black Death swept through Europe, killing up to 60% of the population, most people with sense fled infected areas. But two professions walked directly into the heart of the outbreak: rat catchers and plague doctors. Let's start with the rat catchers, medieval pest control specialists who didn't have the luxury of knowing they were actually fighting the vector of the disease. In the 14th century, no one understood that the bubonic plague was carried by fleas that lived on rats. They just knew that where there were lots of rats, people seemed to get sick and die. A medieval rat catcher was part exterminator, part public sanitation worker, and fully at risk. Their tools were primitive: trained dogs or ferrets, crude traps, and sometimes just their bare hands. Many would patrol the streets at night with clubs, sacks, and lanterns, hunting down rodents in the dark corners of medieval cities. The job paid by the rat, literally per tail, with catchers bringing in sacks of dead rodents to collect their bounty. Some enterprising but unethical rat catchers even started breeding the creatures to ensure a steady income, releasing young rats back into the city to catch later. Medieval job security, I suppose. The dangers were numerous and deadly. First, and most obviously, rat catchers handled potentially plague-infected animals all day, every day. They were constantly exposed to the very fleas that transmitted the disease. It would be like working with COVID patients in 2020 while believing the disease was caused by bad air. You're in danger, but you don't even know what the danger actually is. But rats themselves were no joke either. Cornered rats can be vicious, and their bites frequently led to serious infections in an age before antibiotics. Rat catchers often had hands and arms covered in scars from bites and scratches, each one a potential entry point for deadly bacteria. The places where rats thrived were hazards in themselves: sewers, garbage dumps, cellars, graveyards. Rat catchers navigated dark, unstable spaces filled with filth and decay. Falls, exposure to toxic waste, and encounters with other vermin were occupational hazards. And since much of their work happened at night, add in the dangers of navigating medieval cities in darkness, from simple falls to encounters with criminals. Despite providing an essential service, rat catchers were social outcasts. They carried the stench of their work, were associated with disease and filth, and were often viewed with suspicion. The very people whose lives they might have been saving wanted nothing to do with them. But if rat catchers were the unsung, unappreciated frontline workers of plague epidemics, plague doctors were their more respected but equally doomed counterparts. The image of the plague doctor is iconic: that beaked mask, the head-to-toe leather or waxed canvas garments, the wide-brimmed hat, the cane used to examine patients from a distance. It's the medieval equivalent of a hazmat suit, and while it looked impressive, it was based on completely incorrect medical theories. The distinctive beak was stuffed with herbs, flowers, spices, or vinegar-soaked sponges, anything with a strong smell. This was based on the miasma theory of disease, which held that sickness was spread by bad air or miasma. The pleasant-smelling substances were supposed to counteract the disease-causing stench. Spoiler alert, perfume doesn't stop bacterial infections. Despite their dramatic appearance, plague doctors had almost nothing effective in their medical arsenal. Their treatments ranged from the useless to the actively harmful: bloodletting, applying mercury ointments, lancing and draining buboes, the infamous swollen lymph nodes characteristic of bubonic plague, and prescribing various cures containing everything from ground emeralds to dried toad. Most plague doctors weren't even the most educated physicians of their time. Many were second-rate doctors who couldn't establish successful practices otherwise, or young physicians just starting their careers who needed the unusually high salaries plague towns offered. Some weren't doctors at all. Barbers and butchers sometimes filled the role when trained physicians were unavailable or unwilling. The job was essentially a death sentence. Records from Italian cities indicate that plague doctors often died within weeks of taking up their positions. Their protective gear was based on flawed understanding of disease transmission and offered minimal actual protection. Being surrounded by plague victims all day meant constant exposure to the bacteria, and their treatments often involved direct contact with infectious bodily fluids. Cities were so desperate for plague doctors that they offered extraordinary salaries. sometimes 10 times what a physician could normally earn. Some towns even offered free housing, food and guaranteed income for life, which was usually a very short-term commitment for the city to fulfill. Beyond treating the sick, or more accurately, watching them die while applying useless remedies, plague doctors had other duties. They conducted crude autopsies to study the disease, kept records of deaths for city authorities, and were often responsible for enforcing quarantines, marking infected houses, and reporting those who broke isolation. The psychological toll must have been immense. Imagine spending your days making life or death decisions, knowing that almost nothing in your medical toolkit actually worked. You'd witness entire families die despite your best efforts. Parents would beg you to save their children, and you'd have nothing effective to offer. Your failure rate would approach 100%. Both rat catchers and plague doctors served vital social functions during history's deadliest pandemics, even if their methods were largely ineffective by modern standards. They stepped forward when everyone else was running away. Some were motivated by money, others by genuine desire to help, but regardless of motivation, they put themselves directly in death's path. So the next time you call an exterminator for a mouse problem, or visit a doctor for an infection that a simple antibiotic will clear up, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. Those medieval professionals faced the same problems with nothing but leather gloves or herb-filled masks, and often paid with their lives. But dangerous as these plague-fighting professions were, at least they came with some social status or decent pay. Our next group of medieval workers faced death daily for barely enough wages to survive, all while building the monuments that tourists still flock to photograph today. All right, so far we've trudged through sewage, scraped rotting flesh, chiseled rock in the dark, dodged molten metal, and wrestled with plague rats. But now, let's take a deep breath, and immediately regret it. Because this next job fills your lungs with soot, your skin with burns, and your nightmares with claustrophobia. Welcome to the grim, sooty world of the chimney sweep, a profession so awful it was literally child's play. No, really, they gave this job to kids, because obviously, when facing a dark, pitch-black vertical tunnel filled with ash, smoke, and jagged brick edges, the logical solution is to throw an 8-year-old up there and hope for the best. In medieval and especially early modern Europe, homes and buildings relied on wood or coal-burning fireplaces to stay warm. That meant chimneys, and chimneys needed to be cleaned regularly, or they'd clog, backdraft smoke, or, worst-case scenario, catch fire and take half the street with them. So, someone had to keep them clear. Someone small, someone desperate. Enter the climbing boys, often orphaned, impoverished, or straight up sold into servitude. These children, sometimes as young as 5, were hired or apprenticed to master sweeps, who would then send them up the chimneys with brushes, scrapers, and occasionally just their bare hands. No ropes, no safety harnesses, no protective gear, just a kid, a brush, and a prayer. Climbing chimneys wasn't just dirty, it was a death trap. Chimneys weren't straight, clean tubes like modern ones. They were narrow, crooked, and full of protrusions. Some were barely wide enough for a child's shoulders. Boys would climb up them by bracing their knees and elbows against the walls, inching upward in total darkness. One wrong move, and you'd fall, hitting brick ledges on the way down like a soot-covered pinball, assuming you didn't get stuck first. And getting stuck was horrifyingly common. Chimneys could narrow unexpectedly, or the soot could cake so thick it created impassable blockages. There are documented cases of boys suffocating mid-chimney, wedged in so tightly they couldn't even call for help. Sometimes they were only discovered when the family lit a fire and the house started to fill with smoke, and something else. Even if you didn't suffocate or fall, you were still inhaling soot and ash with every breath, day after day, year after year. This led to a condition we now call chimney sweeps carcinoma, the first industrially linked cancer ever identified. It affected the scrotum of young boys exposed to soot for years. Yes, that's right. The job was so toxic, it literally gave them cancer in their underwear. And since we're keeping score, 3rd-degree burns from hot chimneys? Check. Crushed limbs from falls? Check. Permanent lung damage? Check. Lifelong trauma from being shoved into blackened brick tunnels every day of your formative years? Absolutely. You might be wondering, where were the parents? In many cases, these kids didn't have any, or they were sold off by desperate families who couldn't afford to feed them. Chimney sweeping was often a form of child slavery disguised as apprenticeship. Once under a master sweep, the boys were expected to sleep in basements or sheds, clean their own masters' homes and work endlessly, all for a crust of bread and, if they were lucky, not being beaten that day. And beaten they were. If a child refused to climb, often out of sheer fear or because they were injured, the master would encourage them with hot pokers, pins in their feet, or even lighting small fires to smoke them upward. That's right, they'd literally light a fire beneath them to force them up the chimney. It's hard to believe this was real history and not a Dickensian fever dream, but sadly, it was all too common. In larger towns and cities, chimney sweeps became essential, especially in wealthier homes with multiple fireplaces. Some cities even passed laws requiring chimneys to be cleaned at regular intervals, which meant the demand for sweep boys remained high. And with high demand and no regulations, the exploitation just kept going. It wasn't until the late 18th and 19th centuries that society began to really reckon with how horrifying this practice was. Reformers like George Smart and Lord Shaftesbury campaigned against child labour in the sweeping industry. In 1788, a law was passed in Britain, banning the use of children under 8. Spoiler, it wasn't enforced. Several more decades and campaigns later, stronger laws finally started banning child chimney sweeps altogether, though the practice still continued illegally for years. By then, countless boys had already lived and died in soot and silence, climbing the narrow arteries of city homes and mansions alike, most without a name remembered. The image of a chimney sweep has been sanitised over the years. Think Mary Poppins-style whimsy and cheerful Cockney tunes. But behind the myth was a brutal reality, a profession that literally consumed children to keep the fires of the wealthy burning bright. So, the next time you see a quaint brick chimney on a cosy old house, remember what it took to keep those chimneys clean in centuries past, and be grateful you weren't born holding a brush and forced to climb into the dark with no way out but up. And as horrifying as that sounds, our final profession may be even stranger, a job that mixed gore with pageantry, death with duty, and where success meant no one booed you off the scaffold. All right, we've seen jobs that risk drowning in waste, suffocation in soot, and death by molten metal. But what if your job was death itself? Not avoiding it, not dancing with it, delivering it. Meet the medieval executioner, the man who turned capital punishment into both a performance and a profession. Now, at first glance, this might sound kind of badass. You're the guy with the axe, the hood, the power. You stride onto the scaffold, crowd waiting, blade gleaming in the sun. One swing and justice is served, right? Well, kind of. But also very much not, because being an executioner in medieval Europe wasn't glamorous. It was socially isolating, mentally scarring, and logistically horrifying. You were both feared and needed, respected from a distance, like a walking blade no one wanted to stand too close to. Let's start with the basics. Executioners didn't just execute. That was maybe the most visible part of the job, but between public displays they had a long and gruesome to-do list. Torture? That was them. Branding criminals? Also them. Dismembering bodies? Yep. Cleaning up after executions? Definitely them. Collecting heads and boiling them in tar for display on spikes? You bet. They were literally responsible for all stages of state-sanctioned death and punishment. Medieval justice systems outsourced their dirtiest work to the executioner, and then had the audacity to pretend he didn't exist afterward. And don't think this was always clean either. Beheading with a sword or axe wasn't guaranteed to go smoothly. A strong practiced swing might take the head off in one go, but if the executioner missed his mark, or didn't have the strength, or the blade was dull, well, things got ugly. There are documented cases of 3, 4, even 5 strikes needed to finish the job. At that point, the crowd would often boo, jeer, or even riot. Imagine the pressure. You're trying to deliver a precise, fatal blow under the watchful eyes of hundreds, maybe thousands, and if you mess it up, you're not just embarrassed, you're publicly hated, and covered in blood. and probably being pelted with cabbage. Some executioners were specialists in hanging, which came with its own complications. Too short a rope, and the condemned would slowly strangle to death. Too long and, well, pop goes the neck in a very public, very messy way. Then there were drawings and quarterings, which are so gruesome that even YouTube's algorithm might need a fainting couch if we got too detailed. Executioners often had to assist in torture sessions too, using racks, thumbscrews, hot irons, you name it. Not only did you have to inflict pain with clinical precision, but you had to keep the person alive long enough to suffer it. Think about that. Your job wasn't just to kill, it was to not kill too quickly. And all of this? It came with serious social consequences. Executioners were pariahs. Their touch was considered defiling. In many towns, they had to live outside the city walls. They couldn't enter certain buildings, marry into respectable families, or even sit next to others at church. Imagine spending all week torturing thieves and decapitating heretics, then being told you can't buy bread from the local baker because you're unclean. And yet, people needed them. Badly. Executions weren't just punishments, they were events. Whole towns would gather to watch. Vendors sold food, children sat on shoulders. It was the original public spectacle, with the executioner as the main act. A good executioner was valued for his precision, strength, and cool head under pressure. Some even became minor celebrities, paid well and protected by local lords. In fact, some families passed the role down through generations, becoming execution dynasties. You might be born into a legacy of death, trained from youth to swing the axe cleanly, to read the crowd, to know just how long to hold a severed head aloft before tossing it in the basket. Like father, like son, but with blood on your apron. In parts of Europe, executioners also took on another, weirder role. They were the town's unofficial doctor. Why? Because they knew anatomy better than most. After all, they spent their days cutting people open. So, if you had a hernia or a dislocated joint, guess who might fix it? That's right, the same guy who beheaded your cousin last week. And then there was the psychological toll. Imagine doing this job for years, watching the light leave hundreds of eyes, having to maintain calm as mothers wept, criminals screamed, or nobles tried to bribe you for a cleaner death. Some executioners became numb, others became unstable. A few just drank themselves into oblivion between jobs. And yet, like all the other jobs we've explored tonight, someone had to do it. Medieval society demanded order, and order, unfortunately, often meant violence. And when the state needed someone to deliver that violence in a controlled, ritualized way, it turned to the man with the axe. So, the next time you hear the phrase cutting-edge profession, spare a thought for the medieval executioner. Not exactly a people person, not someone you'd invite to your wedding, but crucial, terrifying, and forever covered in the shadow of the scaffold. So far, we've walked in the shoes of the forgotten, the labourers, the cursed, the ones buried by soot and silence. But what if one man tried to change all of that? What if someone looked into the filth, the disease, the poison, and saw a cure? Our next journey steps into the life of a figure who didn't just survive the chaos of the medieval world, he tried to rewrite its rules. His name was Paracelsus, and he lit matches where others saw only darkness. Picture a boy standing on the edge of a salt mine, the air thick with the sting of minerals and metal. The ground beneath his feet rumbles faintly as carts of rock grind across wooden tracks. Somewhere below, men cough through the dust, swinging picks into the bones of the earth. Overhead, the mountains brood silently. Welcome to Einsiedeln, Switzerland, in the dying years of the 15th century, and welcome to the childhood of Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim. Or, as history would remember him, Paracelsus. Even his name sounded like a thunderclap. Paracelsus, beyond Celsus, greater than the great Roman medical authority. It wasn't a nickname, it was a declaration, a challenge. But long before he named himself after a rivalry, Theophrastus was just a boy raised in a world of contradictions, holy mountains and salt pits, sickness and silver, science and superstition. His father, Wilhelm Bombast von Hohenheim, was a physician and a chemist of sorts, a man who believed in herbs, stars, and minerals. The elder Hohenheim had access to rare manuscripts and ancient folk wisdom alike, and he passed both down to his son with equal seriousness. Theophrastus's mother, a probably overworked hospital worker in a local Benedictine abbey, died while he was still young. It was a hard beginning, a small household shadowed by illness, lit by candlelight and the gleam of raw ore. You can imagine the boy growing up wandering between his father's garden of medicinal herbs and the industrial violence of nearby mines. He watched men emerge, blackened with soot and dust, spitting blood into handkerchiefs, their bones bent from years underground. He saw what poison looked like, not just in a vial, but in a man's breath, his skin, his broken posture, and he saw what healing could do when it worked. This dual world, part monastery, part mineshaft, forged something strange in the boy. Where others saw dirt, he saw transformation, lead into gold, death into life. He watched salt extracted from rock and thought, if the earth holds salt, what else does it hide? By his teens, he was already travelling, walking dusty roads in worn shoes seeking teachers. He studied medicine formally at the University of Ferrara in Italy, but not in the obedient, book-loving way his peers did. He hated rote memorization. He hated blind deference. He once said, "A man who wants to study medicine must go to the inn, not the university." He meant it. While others stayed in lecture halls, Paracelsus preferred to speak with barbers, soldiers, midwives, executioners, anyone who had actually worked with the body. He learned Latin and alchemy in one breath, then practiced bloodletting in the next. He listened to astrologers, but scoffed at surgeons who had never touched a wound. He believed healing came not from obeying the ancients, but from understanding the world as it is, messy, painful, and alive. And he was angry. Even young, he burned with something deeper than curiosity, a fury at the arrogance of medical orthodoxy. His future battles with physicians, universities, and entire cities were already forming like a storm behind his eyes. He would not be polite. He would not be patient. He was not here to be liked. By 23, Theophrastus had earned the title of doctor, but he never really stopped being a wandering student. He claimed to have studied in Constantinople, Egypt, and the Holy Roman Empire's darkest corners. He probably exaggerated. He definitely bragged. But the key is this. He went. He walked farther, asked more questions, and got dirtier than any of his peers. And all the while, he was forming a new vision of medicine. One that didn't rely on balancing invisible humours, but on chemical reactions, on experimentation, and on a belief that God had hidden secrets in the body and the stars alike, if only someone was bold enough to look. This wasn't your average doctor in robes. This was a storm in boots. He would go on to burn textbooks, humiliate scholars, cure the incurable, and poison the occasional patient, all while carving a new path through the tangled forest of superstition and science. But before he could challenge the world, he needed to finish his training, not in classrooms, but in plague houses, mining towns, and forgotten alleyways, where disease and desperation lived side by side. The wandering had only just begun. By the time Paracelsus was in his late 20s, it was clear he had no intention of becoming a quiet scholar. He'd studied at Ferrara, yes. He'd earned a medical degree, yes. But if you were expecting him to return home, set up a polite little practice, and quote Hippocrates with reverence, well, you didn't know Paracelsus. He believed the universities of Europe were rotting from the inside out, and not in some abstract philosophical sense. He meant literally rotting, full of decaying ideas, corpse-cold teachings, and doctors who hadn't seen a patient in 20 years. To him, they weren't healers. They were parrots in robes, mumbling Latin, and prescribing outdated treatments based on Galen, a man who had died 1300 years earlier. And Paracelsus? He had thoughts about that. He called Galen and Avicenna liars and book doctors. He publicly burned their texts in Basel, in front of students and colleagues alike, just to make a point. It wasn't a small fire either. It was a bonfire, the kind made to draw a crowd. And then, for good measure, he replaced the ashes with his own medical notes, declaring that no physician should ever treat the sick based on theory alone. To understand just how scandalous this was, imagine walking into Harvard Medical School, dragging out the dean's bookshelf, lighting it on fire, and shouting, "If you've never bled someone with your own hands, you don't deserve to teach." That was Paracelsus. He didn't want to reform the system. He wanted to obliterate it. He preached that doctors needed to learn from the sick, not just the books. That you couldn't understand disease if you'd never seen a body torn apart by it. He'd spent years doing exactly that, walking through war zones, plague towns, mining accidents, and slums. He'd watched people die by the dozens, and more importantly, he paid attention to what didn't work. He noticed, for instance, that balancing humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, wasn't helping anyone. Leeches, purging, and bloodletting were more ritual than remedy, and so he rejected them. He treated patients with chemicals, sulfur, mercury, antimony, iron. Not because he was trying to poison them, though sometimes, well, accidents happened, but because he believed that the body was governed by chemical processes, not cosmic fluids. This made him an early advocate of what we'd now call toxicology, the idea that the dose makes the poison. A little mercury, it might cure a disease. A lot, it'll kill you. The trick was understanding the fine line between cure and curse. To Paracelsus, everything was poison. It was just a matter of proportion. He lectured in German, not Latin, an absolute scandal in academic circles. Latin was the language of the educated, of prestige, of tradition. But Paracelsus said no. He wanted the poor to understand medicine. He believed that if healing was to be real, it had to be accessible. So he taught in taverns. He debated in marketplaces. He wrote in the language of miners, not monks. And he was proud of it. "The universities do not teach all things," he wrote, "so I must teach the people." Of course, this made him enemies. Lots of them. Professors despised his arrogance. Physicians loathed his methods. Apothecaries feared his unpredictable remedies. Some said he was a madman. Others said he was a heretic. One bishop described him as a pig snorting at pearls. But Paracelsus didn't care. He didn't want pearls. He wanted fire. He once wrote that a good doctor must have 3 things: philosophy, astrology, and alchemy. That sounds insane by modern standards, but to him it meant understanding the mind, the heavens, and the elements. He believed that true healing required a unified knowledge of the body and the cosmos. You couldn't treat the heart without understanding fire. You couldn't treat the brain without watching the stars. And more than anything, he believed that experience mattered more than any scroll. The physician must work with his own hands, not just his tongue, he said. And so he did. Even as he was chased from universities, insulted in print, and condemned in church sermons, Paracelsus kept treating patients, kept experimenting, kept writing. He saw himself not as a doctor of his time, but as a doctor ahead of it, dragging medicine out of the medieval muck, one blistering argument at a time. He wasn't trying to fit in. He was trying to burn a path. And next, that path would lead him through blood-soaked battlefields, plague-ridden ghettos, and forgotten alleyways, where he'd try to prove, one broken body at a time, that real medicine didn't come from books. It came from walking among the dying and daring to try something new. By the early 1520s, Paracelsus was done with lecture halls and ivory towers. He packed his satchel, full of herbs, minerals, handwritten notes, probably some mercury just sloshing around, and walked out the university gates for good. Not because he lacked credentials. He had those. He just didn't see the point anymore. Instead, he took his medicine to the places most doctors refused to go: battlefields, mining camps, leper colonies, and the plague-ridden underbellies of Europe. Places where bodies rotted in the streets, where physicians locked their doors, where people weren't just sick, they were abandoned. Paracelsus went toward the screams. He moved constantly. Switzerland, Austria, Italy, France, Germany. A blur of villages, towns, cities, never settling, always looking for patients, stories, evidence. Sometimes he treated beggars on the road. Sometimes he patched up soldiers while musket balls still cracked overhead. He'd sleep in barns, stables, or the back rooms of taverns, often trading treatment for shelter. He was a doctor, yes, but he was also a vagabond, and more than a little infamous. And somehow, he made it work. When the plague returned, as it so often did, Paracelsus didn't flee like the other physicians. He walked into infected towns, set up makeshift clinics, and treated anyone who came to him. His methods were bizarre by modern standards, but they often worked better than the old-school remedies of leeches and prayer. He used chemical compounds, sulfur, mercury, antimony, and herbal concoctions that he tweaked obsessively. He was like a medieval laboratory, constantly testing, adjusting, observing. And he kept notes, thousands of them, scribbled in German, not Latin, full of symbols and poetic turns of phrase. One moment he was writing about the effects of opium on fever. The next he was describing the influence of Mars on the spleen. It was messy, chaotic, borderline mystical, but it was also empirical. He looked at the patient. He tried something. If it worked, he kept it. If it didn't, he changed it. Radical stuff for a time when most doctors didn't even see their patients until the autopsy. One of the reasons he was so effective in these communities was because he spoke their language. Literally, he used vernacular German, not the elite Latin of universities. He swore like a miner, drank like a soldier, and told dirty jokes like a local. People trusted him because he wasn't talking down to them. He talked with them, even as he was rubbing paste made from arsenic and tree bark into a festering wound. Paracelsus also believed that disease wasn't just a matter of bad luck or divine punishment. He insisted that each illness had a specific cause, a revolutionary idea at the time. Most of his peers believed in imbalances of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Paracelsus believed disease came from external agents, toxins, environmental poisons, or even celestial forces, and should be treated accordingly. He even tried organising diseases into categories, naming them, studying their symptoms and patterns. He was building, almost unknowingly, the foundation of modern diagnosis. But to the authorities of the day, it just looked like alchemical heresy. Because let's not sugarcoat it, he still did weird stuff. He'd prescribe powdered emerald for stomach pain. He once claimed he could create a homunculus, a tiny artificial human, from blood and sperm, if you just buried it in horse dung under the right astrological sign. He wasn't exactly wearing a lab coat and safety goggles. He was more like a mad prophet with a scalpel. But again, the sick didn't care. The dying didn't care. If you were coughing up blood in a plague-stricken village, and Paracelsus showed up with a bottle of something that might help, you didn't ask for his resume. You took the bottle and drank, and more often than not you got better. That success only fueled his reputation, and his enemies. Doctors and apothecaries hated him for undercutting their prices and undermining their authority. Town officials feared his popularity. Churchmen muttered about sorcery, but he kept moving, because Paracelsus wasn't trying to become famous, not yet anyway. He was trying to prove that medicine could be something more than ancient texts and fatal rituals. He believed in a kind of divine healing, yes, but not the kind that came from relics or prayers. He believed that God had hidden cures in the earth, in plants, in metals, and in fire, and that it was the physician's job to uncover them, through effort, through pain, through getting your hands dirty. And oh, did he. Next, we'll step into Paracelsus's philosophy itself, the strange, swirling, symbolic worldview that shaped everything he did. Because to him, the body wasn't just flesh. It was a microcosm of the universe, waiting to be decoded. To understand Paracelsus, you can't just follow him through the alleys and plague houses. You have to follow him into the stars. Because to Paracelsus, the world wasn't just made of stone and skin and metal. It was made of symbols, of correspondences, of hidden meanings stitched through every leaf, every lung, every star in the sky. Medicine wasn't just chemistry, it was cosmic decoding. The body was a book, the universe a library, and the physician a translator. Let's start with his idea of the microcosm and macrocosm. In short, the human body was a miniature version of the entire universe. Whatever forces ruled the stars also coursed through your blood. Whatever poisons lay in the earth had their reflection in your organs. The body wasn't separate from nature. It was nature, concentrated into a single, suffering being. This wasn't metaphor. Paracelsus meant it literally. He believed that every organ was governed by a planet. The heart belonged to the sun, the brain to the moon, the liver to Jupiter, the spleen to Saturn, and each of these celestial bodies didn't just rule in the heavens, they shaped your physical health. You could track illness by watching the skies. You could understand the stomach by studying Mars. The stars weren't far away, they were inside you. This is where Paracelsus starts sounding like a mystic, but stay with him. Because from this worldview, he developed a truly radical idea, that healing wasn't about balancing humours, but about targeting specific illnesses with specific remedies. That each disease had a signature, and each cure had one too. He called this the doctrine of signatures. It worked like this. A plant that looked like a body part was probably meant to treat that part. A walnut, shaped like a brain, might help with mental illness. Lungwort, with its spotted leaves resembling lungs, might treat respiratory infections. It sounds unscientific now, but at the time, it was a vast leap forward, a move away from generalized treatment towards sympathetic diagnosis. And it wasn't just visual resemblance. He believed that everything had an essence, and the goal of the physician-alchemist was to draw that essence out. You didn't just boil herbs, you transmuted them. You separated the poisonous part from the healing part. You refined the spirit of the thing. You turned nature into medicine through a kind of sacred science. This is what Paracelsus called spagyrics, his method of preparing chemical remedies by separating and recombining their essential parts. And yes, it's the origin of modern pharmaceutical extraction. Behind the fire and weirdness, he was doing something remarkable, identifying active ingredients centuries before we had microscopes. He once wrote, "What is there that is not a poison? All things are poison, and nothing is without poison. The dose makes the poison." That one line, "the dose makes the poison," became the cornerstone of toxicology. He understood that even healing substances, if overused, could kill, and conversely that even poisons could be medicine, if used in just the right amount. Arsenic, mercury, opium, these were not enemies. They were tools. Dangerous, yes, but powerful. It was all about precision, judgment, balance. And that was Paracelsus in a nutshell, always walking a line between salvation and destruction, between medicine and magic, between genius and madness. His approach was spiritual, yes, but it was also fiercely empirical. He didn't just read books and draw conclusions. He tested, he watched, he learned from what worked and abandoned what didn't. He was a data gatherer long before data had a name. And through it all, he believed that God had hidden cures in the natural world, not to make life easier, but to reward those willing to dig, to sweat, to risk. Healing wasn't supposed to be easy, it was supposed to be earned. Paracelsus believed the physician had a sacred duty, not just to treat illness, but to understand it, to see its place in the divine order of things, to approach disease not as punishment, but as a riddle. So when he mixed mercury with sulfur, when he watched the stars before choosing a treatment, when he whispered to herbs as he crushed them, it wasn't superstition. Not to him. It was alchemy in the truest sense, the transformation of suffering into insight, of base matter into gold. But for all his insight, for all his influence, Paracelsus's path was far from smooth. His ideas didn't just challenge tradition, they threatened livelihoods, reputations, entire institutions. And the backlash? It would come swiftly and without mercy. In our next chapter, we follow him into the heart of conflict, hounded by rivals, chased from cities, and branded a dangerous heretic. Because changing medicine was never just about healing bodies, it meant breaking the old world apart. If Paracelsus had just kept to his medicine, quietly curing the sick in plague towns, writing strange alchemical notes by candlelight, muttering about planetary essences, He might have lived a long, relatively peaceful life, but quiet was never really his style. You see, Paracelsus didn't just challenge the medical establishment, he embarrassed it, and not from a distance. He mocked doctors in public, called them fools, charlatans, and frauds. He once said, "A physician who does not know astrology is no physician, but a fool." In another speech, he claimed a wound would rather be left to rot than be treated by certain university doctors. He didn't just burn books, he burned bridges, gleefully. And the result? He was exiled, denounced and chased from city after city like a man with a contagious curse. Let's rewind to Basel, 1527. At this point, Paracelsus had earned a reputation, equal parts healer and firebrand. A well-connected humanist named Johannes Oporinus helped him land a prestigious position as the city physician and professor of medicine at the University of Basel. For a moment, it looked like Paracelsus might finally be brought into the fold. But he didn't come to play nice. Instead of wearing university robes, he lectured in his work clothes. Instead of speaking Latin, he used plain German. And instead of towing the academic line, he unleashed verbal cannon fire against Galen, Avicenna, and half the faculty. He invited the public to his lectures. He gave free diagnoses to the poor. And when a local magistrate refused to pay him for a medical consultation, Paracelsus threatened him and the city council, in writing. Then he stormed into the courtroom and reportedly shouted, "I would rather be executed by my enemies than give in to the stupidity of this city." Guess how that went? He was forced to flee Basel in the middle of the night. Again. And this became a pattern. In Strasbourg he was welcomed, then driven out. In Nuremberg the medical guilds barred him. In Cologne he was accused of sorcery. In Vienna he was laughed out of court for claiming that a peasant's broken leg could be treated without bleeding. Everywhere he went he left behind a trail of outrage, and not just because of what he said, but because of what he did. Paracelsus was too effective. He was curing people the universities had failed. He was doing it with methods they couldn't understand. He used poisons and minerals when others swore by prayers and leeches. His patients lived, his rivals fumed. The medical world was built on hierarchy, guilds, licenses, deference to ancient authorities. Paracelsus didn't care about any of that. He treated anyone, argued with everyone, and kept no secrets. He published his findings in vernacular language, deliberately undermining the exclusivity of academic knowledge. And that was the real heresy. It wasn't that he was strange, though he absolutely was. It was that he wasn't afraid to share. He made medicine public. Messy, weird, powerful medicine, full of sulfur, mercury, dreams, and danger. To make matters worse, he refused to stay in one place long enough for his enemies to get a solid grip on him. He was constantly on the move, a physician, an alchemist, a refugee. He'd appear in a town, cure a few impossible cases, stir up a hornet's nest of controversy, then vanish down the road with a satchel of herbs and unfinished manuscripts. He slept in monasteries, farmhouses, mining camps. He accepted payment in bread, wine, and sometimes nothing at all. He claimed to speak with angels. He believed the philosopher's stone wasn't just a way to make gold, it was the key to healing all disease, the true medicine of God. To his critics, he was dangerous. To his patients, he was a miracle worker. And to himself, he was just doing what needed to be done. But the strain was showing. Years of wandering, constant conflict, a body poisoned by the very substances he worked with. He'd been assaulted in taverns, sued in courts, vilified in sermons. Even his few supporters couldn't protect him forever. By the late 1530s, he was exhausted. Still writing, still experimenting, still fighting, but wearing down. His body ached, his reputation was tattered, his books were unfinished. The flame was starting to flicker. He had walked for decades across the back roads of Europe, dragging medicine out of its medieval grave. But it came at a price. In our next chapter, we follow him to Salzburg, to the final mysterious end of his journey, a death still shrouded in whispers, suspicion, and maybe even murder. Because for a man who claimed all things were poison, it's worth asking, What finally killed Paracelsus? By the year 1541, Paracelsus was worn thin. He had spent decades as a storm, a man too bold for the lecture halls, too strange for the courts, too honest for the guilds. He had healed the dying, insulted the powerful, and wandered so far across Europe that his enemies couldn't even keep track. But in the end, even storms burn out. He arrived in Salzburg that year, older than his age, body broken by a life of fire and mercury. He had come not for glory, that ship had long since sailed, but perhaps for peace. Some sources say he had been invited by local nobles impressed by his cures. Others say he was simply drifting again, another temporary guest with ink-stained fingers and trembling hands. What we do know is this. By autumn, Paracelsus was dead. The official cause? Complications from a fall, perhaps down a flight of stairs. A head injury, blunt force trauma. And just like that, Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, Paracelsus, was gone. No final statement, no dramatic deathbed speech. Just silence. Or so it seemed, because from the very beginning, rumours swirled. Some claimed it wasn't a fall at all, that he had been murdered, thrown from a window by hired thugs, perhaps under orders from the medical guilds or rival nobles. He had made enemies in every city he passed through. Maybe one of them finally caught up to him. Others believed he had accidentally poisoned himself with the very substances he championed: mercury, antimony, arsenic. He had long insisted that the dose made the poison, but doses are tricky, and Paracelsus wasn't exactly known for subtlety. Then there's the theory that he gave up, that decades of conflict, exile, and exhaustion finally wore him down, that he let go, quietly, like a man closing the final page of a book he had written in blood, sweat, and fumes. He was buried in the cemetery of St. Sebastian's Church in Salzburg, a modest grave for a man who had set the medical world on fire. For years his tomb remained unmarked, largely forgotten. He had left behind stacks of manuscripts, many unfinished, others illegible, full of symbols, metaphors, planetary charts, and strange recipes scribbled between feverish rants about divine metals and cosmic diseases. To most of the medical establishment, he was just a footnote, a dangerous eccentric, a failed alchemist, a loud, inconvenient shadow on the edge of real science. But the story didn't end there. In the centuries that followed, whispers of Paracelsus's work began to resurface. Doctors who once dismissed him started quoting him. Alchemists revered him. Philosophers studied his symbols. And by the 17th century he was no longer seen as a madman. He was called the father of toxicology. And then came the exhumation. In the 19th century, during renovations at St. Sebastian's, Paracelsus's remains were unearthed. What they found was strange. The bones of his skull showed clear signs of violent trauma, as if he had suffered a blow to the head, perhaps confirming the murder theory after all. Today, his grave is marked by a grander monument, a statue, a plaque, a quiet attempt at redemption for a man who never got it in life. But maybe he wouldn't have wanted it. Paracelsus never asked for respect. He didn't seek fame. He didn't care whether the establishment liked him. He cared whether people got better, whether someone gasping for air could breathe again, whether someone written off by every doctor in town might live to see another dawn. He believed that medicine should be practiced in the streets, not the salons, that it should be dangerous, messy, personal, that healing was not a ritual, it was a reckoning, and he died the same way he lived, out of place, out of time, and out of reach. But in that silence something remained. In the pages he left behind, the lives he saved, and the poisons he dared to turn into cures. Because while his body lay still in Salzburg, his ideas kept moving. And in our final chapter, we trace the shadow he left behind, the strange resurrection of a man who once declared that the world must be remade in fire. Paracelsus died quietly, but his ideas refused to stay buried. For nearly a century after his death, his name was whispered more than spoken. Too weird, too dangerous, too heretical. His manuscripts were scattered, his medicines misunderstood, and his enemies outlived him in the universities. He had challenged the world, and the world tried to forget. But then, something strange happened. They couldn't, because Paracelsus had left too much behind. Not just in his books, though there were many, half alchemical rants, half medical treatises, often written in a mix of German, Latin, and whatever dialect suited the moment. But in his ideas, in his refusal to obey, in his insistence that knowledge should come from experience, not inheritance. By the 1600s, a new generation of thinkers started to dig through the ashes. Renaissance physicians, alchemists, and natural philosophers began rereading Paracelsus with fresh eyes, and what they found was astonishing. Here was a man who had proposed that disease came from external causes, not mystical humours. A man who used chemical treatments when everyone else was still sticking leeches on people's necks. A man who believed the dose makes the poison, who tried to isolate active substances, and who saw medicine as something that required risk, intuition, and fire. In short, Paracelsus had been centuries ahead of his time, and slowly the tide turned. His name crept back into lectures. His quotes began appearing in printed treatises. His eccentric symbols became sources of fascination instead of ridicule. By the Enlightenment, he was being called the father of toxicology, the pioneer of chemical medicine, and even a prophet of pharmacology. He had once been chased from cities. Now he was inspiring university curriculums. But the resurrection didn't stop there. Artists and mystics took hold of him next. Goethe cited him. Nietzsche admired him. Carl Jung built entire layers of his psychology around the kind of symbolic thinking Paracelsus had practiced centuries earlier. The idea that diseases could be metaphors, that healing could be alchemical, that transformation wasn't just chemical, it was spiritual. He became a kind of mythic figure, part doctor, part wizard, part revolutionary. In occult circles, his name sat alongside Hermes Trismegistus and Zoroaster. In medical circles, he was remembered as the man who first asked, "What if the cure is hidden inside the poison?" And yes, even today, we still use one of his most famous lines. All things are poison, and nothing is without poison. The dose alone makes it so a thing is not a poison. That sentence alone reshaped the way we think about medicine, drugs, and risk. Every time you hear about dosage, toxicity, or therapeutic thresholds, that's Paracelsus whispering through the centuries. But maybe what matters most isn't the science he started, or the institutions that eventually claimed him. Maybe it's what he stood for. He believed healing wasn't supposed to be clean, that it came from looking directly into the wound, not turning away. That knowledge should be earned, not inherited. That truth lived in the body, in the earth, in the sky, not just in books. He believed a physician should be fearless, and he was. Paracelsus didn't wait for approval. He didn't care if the gatekeepers let him in. He kicked the doors down, mixed mercury with prayer, and dared the world to catch up. He walked into plague zones, called out the most powerful men in Europe, and never stopped believing that the world could be better if someone was willing to risk everything to heal it. So yes, he died in a quiet room, but centuries later his voice still echoes. In every risky experiment, in every broken rule that leads to a breakthrough, in every cure pulled from the edge of chaos. Paracelsus isn't just a name in a dusty book, he's the fire under the flask. We've followed the life of a man who challenged death, one cure at a time, a firebrand walking the crumbling edge of medieval medicine. But now, we step even further back, beyond one man, beyond one city, into the slow collapse of a world that once believed it would last forever. This is the story of how Rome, not in a single night, but over centuries, unraveled. Not with an explosion, but with a long, aching sigh. Welcome to the fall of an empire. You wouldn't have known it was doomed. Walk through Rome in the 2nd century CE, and the world felt eternal. Marble columns stretched into a cloudless sky. Aqueducts carried water over miles of hills. Fountains gushed. Statues stared coldly from pedestals. Markets bustled with spices from Syria, wool from Britain, and rumours from Africa. In every direction there were signs of control, of order, of a civilization so vast and well-oiled that it seemed almost immune to time. This was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. 200 years of relative calm, from Augustus to Marcus Aurelius. The empire stretched from the misty forests of Germania to the golden sands of Egypt. 50 million people lived under the eagle's shadow. The roads, straight, wide, military-born, ran like veins across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. To be Roman meant safety. It meant law. It meant the gods were with you. At least, that's what the wealthy told themselves. But here's the thing. The idea that Rome was stable, that it would last forever, was a luxury illusion. From the inside, especially for the rich, everything looked fine. The temples still stood. The legions still marched. Grain ships still arrived. People gossiped about theatre scandals and debated Stoic philosophy while sipping imported wine. To them, decline wasn't a possibility. It was unthinkable. That's what makes the fall so terrifying. Empires rarely collapse in flames. They rot, quietly, invisibly, while the fountains still flow and the senators still argue in marble halls. It's only when the walls start cracking that anyone looks up. But let's pause here, for a moment, and really picture Rome at its height. Imagine waking up in an insula, a tall apartment building made of brick and wood. If you're poor, you're up on the 5th floor, close to the roof, where the wind whistles through every crack. If you're wealthy, maybe you live on the ground floor, near a communal fountain. You step outside, and immediately you're surrounded by smells. Bread, olive oil, sweat, sewage. You hear vendors calling out, sandals slapping stone, the distant ring of a smith's hammer. You pass temples, you nod at soldiers. You stop at a public bath, hot, cold, and sweating with half the city. Rome was loud, complex, alive. Every moment felt like proof of its greatness. And it wasn't just Rome. The empire had dozens of glittering cities. Alexandria with its libraries, Carthage with its villas, Trier with its fortified walls. From Hadrian's Wall in Britain to the ports of Antioch, Roman order was stamped into the landscape. But that same order came at a price. Taxes were high. Slavery kept the machine running. The poor scraped by while senators debated over imported peacock meat. And out beyond the borders, in the lands labelled barbarian, people watched, listened, waited. Internally, cracks were already forming. The economy strained under its own weight. The bureaucracy bloated, corruption festered. Military loyalty began to shift, from the idea of Rome to whoever paid better. Still, to most citizens, Rome felt unshakable, like the sun, or the Tiber, or the gods. Empires don't fall, they endure, until they don't. Because just beyond that illusion of permanence, change was coming. Not all at once, not with one invasion or one bad emperor, but slowly, like rot in the foundation. The eagle standard still glimmered in the sun. The amphitheatres still echoed with cheers. But beneath the stone, something was beginning to give way. And in the coming centuries, that slow unravelling would touch everyone, from slaves in back alleys to emperors on golden thrones. Rome didn't collapse because it was conquered. Not at first. It collapsed because it forgot how to hold itself together. In the years after its peak, something started to sour inside the empire. Slowly, subtly. The outward forms remained, the marble, the titles, the rituals. But underneath it all, the system was breaking down. Let's start with the bureaucracy. In theory, Rome had a well-oiled administration, provincial governors, tax collectors, magistrates. But by the 3rd century, it had become a bloated, tangled mess. Jobs were bought instead of earned. Officials skimmed off the top. Tax collectors demanded more than what was owed, and kept the difference. Provinces that couldn't pay were punished, bled dry, then punished again for failing. And who got hit the hardest? The poor. Peasants who once farmed their own land were buried under debt. Many were forced to sell their farms and work as colony, tenant farmers, legally tied to the land. It wasn't quite slavery, but it wasn't freedom either. It was the slow birth of what would later become serfdom. Meanwhile, the wealthy did what the wealthy have always done when things get shaky. They insulated themselves. They fled to country villas, built private militias, paid bribes instead of taxes. In some regions, wealthy landowners were more powerful than the imperial governors. And what did the emperors do? Well, a lot of them panicked. Some tried reforms. Others just fought to keep their thrones. The 3rd century alone saw over 20 emperors in 50 years, most of them killed by their own troops. Some ruled for months, some for days. A few didn't even survive their journey to Rome. The imperial throne had become a death sentence with a laurel crown. In some parts of the empire, soldiers began selling their loyalty to the highest bidder. Generals turned on emperors. Emperors turned on generals. The legions became more loyal to their commanders than to the abstract idea of Rome. This wasn't just political drama, it was institutional decay. Imagine trying to run a continent-spanning empire when every new leader resets the rules, when armies roam without orders, when corruption eats through every level of administration like dry rot in an old beam. Things still function, but they creak, and every time you put weight on the system, it groans a little louder. The rot reached the military too. Rome's armies were once the pride of the empire, disciplined, professional, devastating. But over time, they became harder to recruit, harder to fund, and harder to trust. The empire began hiring foreign mercenaries, so-called barbarians, to fill its ranks. Some were loyal, others weren't. But the deeper problem was this. The very idea of a Roman soldier had changed. Once it meant honor, citizenship, duty. Now it meant a paycheck. Meanwhile, in cities and villages, people began to notice the change. Roads weren't repaired, justice slowed, banditry increased, famines hit harder and lasted longer. And still, the emperors held games and minted coins with grand titles like Restorer of the World or Unconquered Victor. The illusion was still intact, but just barely. And beneath all this, the corruption, the infighting, the debt, something more subtle was happening. Trust was disappearing. Trust in the state, in the army, in the money, in the future. And without trust, an empire can keep moving. But only for so long. The rot wasn't always visible, but it was everywhere. In the tax records, in the starving villages, in the forgotten border towns. Rome still looked like an empire, but its spine was beginning to bend. And while it strained to keep up appearances, forces beyond its borders were watching, waiting, gathering. Because when an empire begins to fall apart from the inside, it doesn't take much from the outside to push it over the edge. While Rome rotted from within, the world outside its borders didn't wait politely. It shifted, swelled, and slowly began to press in. For centuries, Rome had seen itself as a fortress of civilization surrounded by chaos. Beyond the empire's edge were the barbari, a catch-all term for the uncivilized, from Germanic tribes in the north to desert peoples in the east. They didn't speak Latin, they didn't build cities, they didn't worship Jupiter or pay taxes. In Roman eyes, they were outsiders, useful at times, dangerous at others. But by the late 4th century, those outsiders were no longer content to stay outside. Let's back up a bit. The Roman Empire had always had border problems, raids, skirmishes, opportunistic tribes poking at the edges. But the imperial army usually handled it. Forts were built, treaties were signed, bribes were paid. And for a while, that system worked, until it didn't. The real shift began far away, in the vast, icy steppes of Central Asia, where the Huns emerged. We don't know much about the early Huns, but when they arrived, they were like a lightning storm on horseback. Fast, brutal, and terrifyingly alien. Their sudden appearance in the late 4th century sent a shockwave rippling westward. Tribes who once lived peacefully near Rome's borders suddenly began to flee, desperate to escape the oncoming tide. Among them were the Visigoths, a Gothic tribe who had lived near the Danube, sometimes fighting Rome, sometimes trading with it. But now they came begging for shelter. In 376 CE, thousands of Gothic families, men, women, children, arrived at the Roman border and pleaded for asylum. They were starving, they were scared, and they were armed. Rome agreed to let them in. Sort of. Roman officials, as always, saw an opportunity. They extorted the Goths, sold them dog meat at inflated prices, took their children as hostages, and soon the hungry, humiliated newcomers revolted. In 378, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Roman army met the Visigoths in open battle and was obliterated. The Emperor Valens was killed. 2/3 of the Roman force was wiped out. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman history. And suddenly, the unthinkable became real. Rome's borders weren't just leaking, they were breaking. From there, things escalated. The Visigoths didn't leave. They roamed the empire, looting, negotiating, settling. Eventually they marched right into Italy. And in 410 CE, led by Alaric, they sacked the city of Rome. Let that sink in. For the first time in nearly 800 years, the Eternal City had been taken by outsiders. It wasn't just a military loss. It was a psychological earthquake. Rome, the centre of the world, violated. The headlines, had they existed, would have read, "The unthinkable has happened." And yet, the Visigoths weren't the only ones knocking. The Vandals, Burgundians, Franks, Angles, Saxons and Lombards, a patchwork of Germanic and other tribes, were all on the move. Some were pushed by the Huns. Others came looking for land, wealth or protection. Some were enemies. Others were recruited into the Roman military itself, paid soldiers defending the very empire they were dismantling piece by piece. Rome tried to play politics, tried to pit tribe against tribe, tried to settle these groups in exchange for peace. But the empire was no longer strong enough to dictate terms. It was reactive, weakened, fragmented. And then came Attila. The so-called Scourge of God led the Huns in a brutal rampage through Eastern and Western Europe. Cities burned, entire populations fled. Rome barely escaped a direct sack, only after sending envoys, gold and prayers. But the damage wasn't just physical. With each wave of invasion, each surrender, each failed treaty, the idea of Roman invincibility faded. The empire's borders, once clear and proud, were now blurred, porous and meaningless in many places. It wasn't just that the barbarians were coming in, it was that Rome no longer had the strength to keep them out, and with every new settlement, every battlefield loss, every divided loyalty in the ranks, the great imperial facade cracked further. The empire hadn't fallen, not yet, but the pressure from without had exposed the weakness within, and next, we'll see what happened when that pressure met a crumbling economy and a city stretched beyond its breaking point. Rome didn't just collapse under the weight of swords, it collapsed under the weight of its own debt, disease and desperation. As pressure from the borders intensified, the empire's economy, once the bloodstream of its power, began to hemorrhage. The fall wasn't sudden, it was slow, like a coin worn thin over centuries until it finally snapped in two. At its height, Rome's economy was dazzling. Trade routes crisscrossed 3 continents. Gold from Africa, grain from Egypt, silk from China. Roman coins travelled farther than Roman armies. Taxes flowed in from hundreds of provinces. The state could feed armies, fund spectacles, and pave roads across entire empires. But that golden age was already cracking by the 3rd century, and by the 4th and 5th, it was breaking apart. Let's start with the currency. The Roman denarius, once a sturdy silver coin, became a hollow shell. As costs rose, emperors did what desperate governments often do. They debased the currency, mixed the silver with cheaper metals, melted down the old coins, reissued new ones that looked the same but were worth far less. Sound familiar? The result? Rampant inflation. Prices soared. A loaf of bread might cost 10 times what it had a year before. Soldiers demanded higher wages. Merchants refused to accept imperial coinage. Barter returned to markets. In some regions, money was replaced with livestock, sacks of grain or iron tools. Meanwhile, the empire's tax system grew viciously rigid. Tax collectors weren't just administrators, they were enforcers. If a region couldn't meet its quota, the burden fell on the few who could. And if you were rich enough to bribe the right people, you got out of it entirely. That meant the burden fell on the middle and lower classes, crushed beneath the weight of an empire too broke to feed itself, but too proud to admit it. Some families fled into the countryside just to escape tax records. Others joined monasteries. Even becoming a bishop, with the right connections, was a financial refuge. anything to avoid the reach of the imperial treasury. And then there were the plagues. Rome had never been immune to disease. Urban life, dense, dirty, and highly mobile, was the perfect breeding ground. But as trade and military campaigns stretched the empire thin, new pathogens found new highways. The Antonine Plague in the 2nd century had already rattled the empire, possibly smallpox, killing millions. The plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century, likely measles or another unknown virus, decimated populations again. But worse was yet to come. In the 5th century, as the economy reeled and the borders cracked, new waves of disease swept through the empire. Refugees brought illness, armies spread it. Cities, once engines of commerce, turned into morgues. Entire towns were abandoned. In some provinces, population drops of 30 to 50% weren't unusual, and with every death, productivity collapsed. Fewer farmers meant food shortages. Fewer craftsmen meant goods rotted in storehouses. Trade routes dried up. Cities shrank. Taxes fell even further behind. So what did Rome do? It tightened control, locked people into professions. If your father was a baker, you were a baker, for life. Same for soldiers, blacksmiths, and farmers. This was no longer the flexible Roman citizenship of old. It was a state grasping at control, freezing its own people in place. And people noticed. By the 5th century, for many ordinary citizens, the question wasn't, how do we save Rome? It was, what is Rome even doing for us? The emperors still wore purple, the bureaucrats still wrote grand edicts. But the roads were crumbling, the markets were bare, the taxes were brutal, and now the air was filled with sickness. What held everything together in the past, infrastructure, money, belief, was beginning to unravel, and with it, the empire's very identity. The West was becoming something new, not all at once and not with one final gasp, but with 1,000 tiny cuts. Cuts from within, cuts from beyond, cuts made by time, hunger, and fear. And still, the people clung to something bigger than coins or borders. They clung to faith, and that faith, once Roman, now Christian, was about to reshape the soul of the empire forever. As the empire crumbled in politics, in economy, and in plague, something else was shifting beneath the marble floors and temple stones. Something less visible, but no less powerful. The soul of Rome was changing. For over 1,000 years, Roman religion was a tapestry of gods, rituals, and civic pride. Jupiter, Mars, Venus, gods that mirrored human strength and weakness. Every event had its ceremony. Every city had its sacred hearth. Emperors were often deified. Religion was public, performative, and deeply Roman. But by the 4th century, those old gods were fading, and in their place, a once persecuted faith that had begun in back alleys and catacombs. A religion born in the eastern provinces, spread by fishermen, rebels, and martyrs. A belief system that didn't honor a pantheon, but a single suffering man on a cross. Christianity. To say its rise was dramatic would be an understatement. For centuries, Christians were outsiders, sometimes tolerated, sometimes hunted. They refused to sacrifice to the emperor. They held secret meetings. They buried their dead in elaborate catacombs instead of burning them. Many Romans saw them as strange, even dangerous. But persecution only strengthened the movement. Stories of martyrdom, lions in arenas, flames in the streets, became spiritual fuel. Converts multiplied, not despite the danger, but because of it. Then, in 312 CE, everything changed. The Emperor Constantine claimed he had seen a vision, a cross of light in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer." He won a key battle, converted to Christianity, though likely slowly and politically, and issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious freedom across the empire. Suddenly, Christianity wasn't just legal, it was imperial. Over the next decades, temples were closed, pagan festivals were repurposed or banned, bishops gained political power. Churches, once built in secret, now rose beside palaces and courts. The Christian Bishop of Rome, once a humble spiritual leader, began to grow into something more. A pope, To many, this was a revolution. To others, it was the beginning of the end, because along with faith came conflict, not between Christians and pagans anymore, but between Christians themselves. Doctrinal disputes exploded. Was Jesus fully divine? Fully human? Both? Was the Holy Trinity one essence or three persons? Councils were convened, heresies were condemned, bishops were exiled, churches rioted. At times it felt less like spiritual awakening and more like civil war in robes. Meanwhile, the pagan world still lingered. Many rural Romans, the Pagani, clung to old gods for generations. Harvest rituals, household altars, whispered prayers to river spirits. Religion didn't change overnight. It bled from one belief to another, often mixing along the way. But the tone of the empire had shifted. Where once the gods were many, now there was one. Where once emperors were divine, now they bowed, at least in theory, to a higher spiritual king. And this spiritual shift had real-world consequences. The church began to take on roles the empire could no longer fulfill, feeding the poor, mediating disputes, preserving knowledge. In a world where governors were corrupt and generals disloyal, bishops became the only trusted authorities left in some cities. Christianity also gave people a new way to interpret collapse. The plagues, a punishment for sin, the invasions, a test of faith, the poverty and hunger, birth pangs of a better world to come. For many, especially the poor, the Christian message of suffering redeemed, of meekness rewarded, of life beyond death, was a light in the gathering dark. But this transformation came with a cost. The old Roman identity, that blend of civic duty, religious ritual, and imperial pride, began to erode. The temples stood empty. The altars crumbled. The empire that once worshipped gods carved in stone now prayed in secret and sang in cathedrals. And as Rome's body weakened, it was this new spiritual backbone that held many communities together. It wouldn't stop the fall, but it would survive it. And in the next chapter we return to the ground, to the moment that shattered Roman pride and sent shockwaves across the known world, the day the unthinkable happened, the sack of Rome. For centuries, Rome was not just a city, it was the city, the eternal city, Caput Mundi, the head of the world, a place whose name alone could silence a room, whose mere survival seemed proof of divine favour. And then, in the year 410 CE, Rome fell. Not completely, not forever. But the sack of Rome by Alaric and his Visigothic army shook the world in a way no military defeat ever had. It was not the size of the attack, it was the symbolism. The unimaginable had occurred. Barbarians had breached the gates and the heart of the empire had been violated. Let's rewind. After the disastrous Battle of Adrianople in 378, the Visigoths were no longer just enemies. They were permanent residents within the empire. They'd been mistreated, exploited, and marginalized, but they were inside the Roman system now, and Alaric, their leader, wanted recognition. He wanted land, resources, and a title, not as a conqueror, but as a general in the Roman army. Rome refused, repeatedly. Alaric tried diplomacy. He offered peace in exchange for food and a secure homeland. He even offered to defend the empire. But the Roman bureaucracy, fractured and arrogant, kept dismissing him. He was, after all, a Goth, a barbarian, a pawn in their eyes. Eventually Alaric stopped asking. He marched on Rome, not once, but 3 times. The first 2 sieges were lifted after negotiation and ransom. The third, there was no more talking. On August 24th, 410 CE, the gates were opened, possibly by slaves or sympathizers. Alaric's army poured into the city, and for 3 days, Rome was sacked, looted, burned, desecrated. Temples were stripped, palaces broken into. Wealth that had taken centuries to gather was carted away in ox-drawn wagons. Thousands were taken as slaves. Some were killed. Many more were simply left stunned, staring at the flames where order once lived. But make no mistake, this wasn't total destruction. Alaric, a Christian himself, ordered that churches be spared. Some Romans were even protected. Compared to what would come in later centuries, this was a disciplined sack. But it didn't feel that way. To the Roman world, and especially to those far from the city, it was the end of an era. News travelled slowly, but when it arrived, people wept. Bishops gave sermons, poets wrote elegies. The idea that Rome could fall, Rome, was an emotional and psychological earthquake. The historian Jerome, writing from distant Bethlehem, famously said, "The city, which had taken the whole world, was itself taken." The shock wasn't just that the city had been breached, it was that it hadn't been prevented, that the empire had been powerless, that the gods, old or new, hadn't intervened. For Roman elites, the sack shattered the illusion that the empire was in control. For the poor, it was just another layer of chaos in an already collapsing world. For the church, it was an opportunity to interpret the fall as a spiritual reckoning, and to step into the role the state had failed to uphold. And for the so-called barbarians, it was a message. Rome was not invincible. The gates had opened, the spell had broken, and once one army marched through, more would follow. Alaric, for his part, didn't gloat. He took what he needed, marched south, and died soon after, reportedly buried under a riverbed, his tomb hidden forever by diverted waters and executed slaves. But the damage was done. The sack of 410 wasn't the end of Rome, not yet, but it was a signal fire, seen from every corner of the empire, a sign that the centre could no longer hold, that emperors could no longer protect their people, that the barbarians weren't just at the gate, they were inside. And from that point on, the Western Roman Empire would never fully recover. The dominoes had begun to fall. Empires rise in palaces, but they fall in kitchens, workshops, and muddy fields. For all the generals and emperors, edicts and invasions, the real story of Rome's decline wasn't told in speeches or battles. It was lived, quietly, painfully, by the millions of ordinary people who woke up each morning in a world they no longer recognized. So what did that world look like? Imagine this. You're a baker in a small town somewhere in Gaul around the mid-5th century. Maybe your father was a veteran, your grandfather a landowner. You were raised on stories of Roman glory, the eagle standards, the clean streets, the orderly world of law and roads. But the streets outside your shop are cracked now. The stones are uneven. The aqueduct hasn't flowed in months, so you haul water from a nearby stream. The market isn't bustling, it's barely functioning. Coins are scarce, taxes are brutal, and sometimes you trade loaves for onions or cloth. There's talk of raiders in the countryside. The local magistrate hasn't been seen in weeks. And every time the church bell rings, you wonder if it's for another funeral. That was life in a crumbling empire, familiar and foreign at the same time. In cities, the population was shrinking. Once grand forums echoed with emptiness. Statues lost their faces to erosion and vandalism. Theatres went unused. Fountains dried up. Bathhouses, once the pride of Roman civilization, closed as the plumbing failed and the patrons disappeared. In some places, people stripped the marble from public buildings to patch their own homes. In rural areas, things were quieter, but just as fragile. Many peasants became tied to the land, no longer free to leave. That freedom, that pride in Roman citizenship, was dissolving into something else. A world of lords and labourers, of oaths and obligations. The seeds of feudalism were taking root, and yet people adapted. When coinage failed, they bartered. When officials vanished, they turned to local bishops. When markets collapsed, they grew their own food. When cities became too dangerous, they moved to the hills or built walls around their villages. Life didn't stop, it just changed, shrunk, hardened, slowed. Culturally, things were shifting too. Latin was still spoken, but it was changing, morphing into local dialects that would one day become French, Spanish, and Italian. Education was harder to access. Libraries decayed. Scribes were now mostly monks. For many, literacy faded, replaced by oral tradition, by memory, by the church's rituals. Religion, in fact, became the emotional bedrock of daily life. The Roman gods were mostly gone, in their place. Saints, relics, and sacred rhythms. The calendar was marked not by imperial festivals, but by feast days and fasts. The bishop was often the most powerful man in town, not because he was wealthy, but because he was there. He could write, he could negotiate, he could pray, but don't mistake this for peace. Violence was still a fact of life. Bandits, rival warlords, foreign armies, they came and went, torching villages, conscripting boys, claiming tribute. Borders blurred, allegiances shifted, and in the middle of it all stood the ordinary Roman, not reading the news, just trying to make it to winter. Still, there was memory. Old men remembered better days. Women told stories of marble streets and golden coins. Some still believed Rome would rise again, that this was just a rough season, not the end. They didn't know, of course, that history rarely works that way. But here's the strange truth. The collapse was uneven. In some places, life was almost normal, just poorer, simpler. In others, it was chaos. One valley might see peace and harvest. The next, raiders and starvation. It wasn't one big fall. It was 1,000 little ones. Gradual, local, personal. And maybe that's what made it so tragic. There was no grand declaration, no sudden silence, just a long, slow forgetting of what Rome had meant, of what it had promised, of what it had built. But not everyone forgot. In the next chapter, we turn our eyes back to the throne, to the last emperors of the West. Fragile figures, caught in a collapsing world, clinging to titles that no longer held meaning. And when the curtain finally falls, it won't be with fire and applause, but with a whisper. By the late 5th century, the title Emperor of the Western Roman Empire had become less crown and more curse. The grandeur remained, at least in theory, but the power behind it had thinned like old parchment, cracking under the weight of enemies, betrayals, and rot. Gone were the days of Augustus and Trajan, of parades and marble arches. Now, emperors were often children, puppets or placeholders, chosen not for strength but for obedience. The throne, once the seat of divine power, had become a revolving door, and the empire it claimed to command was little more than a patchwork of cities clinging to fading authority. Let's take a moment to meet a few of the final emperors of the West, not as legends, but as men, trapped in the machinery of something far too broken to fix. Start with Honorius, who ruled from 395 to 423 CE. He was on the throne when Rome was sacked in 410. But where was he? Nowhere near the capital. He ruled from Ravenna, a more defensible swampside city. When he heard that Rome had perished, he allegedly panicked, not for the city, but for his pet chicken, which was also named Rome. That may be apocryphal, but it captures something real. This wasn't a man leading an empire. This was a frightened boy trying to stay alive. Then came Valentinian III, who ascended at just 6 years old and ruled for 30 chaotic years. During his reign, generals called the shots. The most powerful of them, Flavius Aetius, was arguably the last great Roman field commander. He helped defeat Attila the Hun at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains in 451, a final gasp of Roman military greatness. His reward? Valentinian had him assassinated. Less than a year later, Valentinian himself was killed by Aetius's loyalists. That's how it went. Trust no one, die anyway. Other emperors came and went like gusts of wind. Petronius Maximus ruled for 77 days. When a mob turned on him in panic, he was torn to pieces while trying to flee the city. Avitus, a Gallic aristocrat, was declared emperor by the Visigoths, but was deposed in a coup and possibly starved to death. Anthemius tried to unite the crumbling pieces and fight off invading Vandals. His head ended up on a spike in Rome. These weren't rulers anymore. They were falling dominoes, each one closer to the end. And then there was Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire. He was a teenager, maybe 14, when he was installed in 475 CE. His father, a general named Orestes, had seized power and placed his son on the throne. It wasn't a promotion, it was a buffer, a boy between the army and the blame. Romulus's reign lasted less than a year. In 476 CE, a Germanic general named Odoacer marched on Ravenna, deposed Romulus, and sent the imperial regalia, the symbols of Roman authority, back to Constantinople in the east. There was no great battle, no heroic last stand, just a quiet administrative surrender. Romulus was spared, too young to be hated, too powerless to be feared. Odoacer gave him a pension and allowed him to retire in peace. The last Western Roman emperor faded into obscurity, alive, forgotten, and irrelevant. And that was it. No funeral, no empire-wide mourning, just the soft click of a door closing behind history's most enduring symbol. But what's striking isn't just the fall, it's how small the fall was in the end. No blazing fire, no collapsing Colosseum. Just a boy emperor, a tired army, and a foreign general who decided to stop pretending. By that point, Rome was a ghost of itself. The title emperor had meaning but no might. The provinces had already slipped away. The taxes no longer flowed. The armies obeyed their commanders, not the crown. And so, with almost no resistance, 1,000 years of Western Roman rule ended, not with a war, but with a resignation. But was it really the end? So there it was, 476 CE. The date school books would later underline, highlight, and circle in red ink, the year the Western Roman Empire officially ended. But here's the strange truth. For most people alive at the time, nothing changed overnight. There was no announcement, no ceremony, no divine thunderclap. The roads were still cracked, the churches still held mass, the farms still needed ploughing. For the average villager, the world had already been falling for decades, slow, uneven, and exhausting. By the time Romulus Augustulus was deposed, many had stopped expecting Rome to fix anything anyway. So, what did it actually mean? Let's break it down. In the most basic terms, 476 CE marked the last time a Western emperor ruled from Italy. When Odoacer, the Germanic general, deposed the teenage Romulus, he didn't crown himself a new Caesar. He didn't burn the Senate. Instead, he sent the imperial insignia, the purple robes, the diadem, the standards, to Constantinople, where the Eastern Roman Empire still lived. And then he said, "We don't need two emperors. One is enough." The Eastern Emperor Zeno shrugged, nodded, and agreed. Odoacer would rule Italy as a patrician, technically under Eastern oversight, but in practice as king in all but name. It was less a fall and more a handover. But symbolically, it was seismic, because for over a millennium, Rome had been the axis around which the Western world turned. It wasn't just a city, it was an idea, a promise. The notion that order could be imposed upon chaos, that civilization could stretch from Hadrian's Wall to the Nile, that Latin law, roads, baths, coins, and emperors would last forever. And suddenly, that idea was gone. Not with a bang, but with a quiet shrug. But here's where the story gets messy, because Rome didn't truly die. Not everywhere. Not all at once. The Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, would continue on for nearly 1,000 more years. In Constantinople, emperors still ruled in Roman robes, issuing edicts in Latin and later Greek, calling themselves Caesar and Augustus. They saw themselves not as something new, but as the continuation of everything Rome had ever been. And in the West, the echoes lingered. The Germanic kings who rose in the ashes of empire didn't erase Rome, they borrowed from it. They wore Roman-style crowns, used Roman law codes, hired Roman scribes. Many converted to Christianity, the same faith that had once been persecuted, then crowned. Even the idea of empire didn't disappear. Centuries later, Charlemagne would be crowned Emperor of the Romans by the Pope, reviving the dream of a unified Christian West. And still later, the Holy Roman Empire, with all its contradictions, would claim descent from that original line. The Roman eagle would fly again, just stitched to different banners. So did Rome fall? Yes. And also, no. It ceased to be a state, but lived on as a memory, a model, and a myth. in law, in architecture, in language, in dreams of empire and fears of its collapse. In some ways, Rome is still falling, and in others, it never really did. Because the truth is, civilizations don't collapse like towers, they dissolve, transform, adapt. And the fall of the Western Roman Empire wasn't a single moment. It was a process. Centuries in the making, and centuries in the unravelling. But it left behind more than ruins. It left a world trying to remember itself. Rome fell, but its shadow never did. Even after the emperors were gone, after the legions disbanded and the marble crumbled, Rome kept speaking, not in orders from a throne, but in echoes across time. Because what the empire left behind wasn't just ruins, it was a blueprint for the world to come. So what exactly did it leave us? Let's start with the bones of Europe. Roman roads, some still in use today, became the skeletons of medieval trade routes. Roman bridges spanned rivers long after their builders were forgotten. Cities like London, Paris, Cologne and Vienna rose on Roman foundations. In fact, the very map of modern Europe owes much of its shape to Roman borders, outposts and ambitions. Then there's language. Latin didn't die, it evolved. Fragmented, it turned into French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. Even English, despite its Germanic roots, is stuffed with Latin words, especially after the Norman conquest. Every time you say justice or structure or emperor, you're speaking the empire's ghost. And let's not forget law. Roman legal principles, contracts, citizenship, trial procedures became the bedrock of modern legal systems, especially in continental Europe. The idea that laws should be written, debated and applied universally was radical then, and it's still shaping courts today. But Rome's greatest export wasn't stone or language or law, it was the idea of Rome itself. After 476, every king, pope and general who wanted legitimacy reached back to Rome. Charlemagne revived the imperial crown. The Holy Roman emperors claimed to restore it. Napoleon took its symbols. Mussolini fantasized about it. Even Washington, D.C., with its domes and Latin inscriptions, borrowed Rome's aesthetic to frame its own republic. Because Rome wasn't just a place, it was a concept. Order, power, civilization, permanence, the illusion of a center that could never fall. And yet, it did. That's the irony. The same empire that built arches to eternity lasted only a few centuries in the West. But in falling, it set the terms for what followed. Every time someone asks if a civilization is declining, they're measuring it against Rome. Every time someone warns of an empire's fall, they're speaking Roman. Of course, the real legacy isn't just what Rome left. It's what was lost. The libraries that burned, the voices silenced, the crafts and sciences forgotten in the chaos, the cities emptied, the children who grew up in a world smaller, hungrier, and more violent than their parents had known. There's no way to tally it all, but you can feel the weight of it in the silence between ruins. Still, people kept going. Monks copied books. Farmers planted seeds. Builders reused old bricks. The world didn't end. It recomposed itself. Rougher. Stranger, but still pulsing with life. And in the long run, that might be Rome's most haunting legacy of all. Not its grandeur, but its fragility. Because Rome teaches us that even the strongest systems crack. That wealth, law, and power can't outrun time forever. That decline doesn't come with a trumpet. It comes with leaking roofs and unpaid soldiers, and kids who grow up not knowing the stories their grandparents told. It also teaches us that humans adapt, that they rebuild, that even after the worst, something grows in the ruins. And maybe that's why we keep coming back to it. Because Rome wasn't just a past, it's a mirror. And somewhere inside it, we see ourselves, dreaming of order, fearing collapse, and trying, against all odds, to leave behind something that lasts. Thanks for spending this quiet journey through history with me. I hope tonight's stories helped ease your mind and carry you gently toward rest. Sleep well, dream deep, and I'll see you in the next video.